So we'll move from vaccinations and pandemics and whatever and epidemics. We'll move to death and dying, and not inappropriately. But so I thought I would do today, and with apologies because I think this has been postponed twice now, and so we're finally getting to it. I thought I would do in let's call it section two of the workshops is let's talk through in sequence what happens from a Jewish point of view for the deceased, but more importantly, for those who are mourning and those who are bereaved. What's the sequence, and what are all the different stages that we go through, and what are some of the customs that have developed to help those who are mourning, to help them through the process. So we'll go through it that way. Don't hesitate to ask a question, raise a hand, send me a message, whatever it might be, and we'll see how long this takes, and then we can decide if we're going to go into a volume number three and what we've left out. Um, so we begin, well, sorry for this. We begin with the end, right? Okay. So we begin with the recognition that someone is about to die. Whether it's the individual alone, whether it's with family members present, sometimes they call the rabbi and say, "Will you come over?" We don't believe in last rites. There are no specific blessings that are recited to either. There are, some different bubba mices and superstitions and things that might happen to ease the soul, the departing soul, on its journey. But the only real traditional thing that is to be done at the time of death is what's called the Vidui. Now, Vidui is a confession. We have a confession that we recite publicly and communally on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement. But this Vidui is what is recited individually, ideally by the person who knows that the moment of death is close. That's usually not possible. So a family member or the rabbi or whatever can recite it for the person, and then ending with the reciting of Shema. So this is the traditional wording. I'll do it in English, but this is the traditional version, the wording of the Vidui. I acknowledge before you, Adonai, my God and God of our ancestors, that both my cure and my death are in your hands. May it be your will to send me perfect healing. Now that's a translation. He is what they usually said, but it's actually shalemut. It's actually wholeness, and from shalom, and from peace, rather than recuperation, like from healing. Yet, if this is not your determination, I accept it. In your presence, I atone for all my sins and transgressions. O God, bestow upon me the abounding happiness that is treasured up for the righteous people in the world to come. Make known to me the path of life. You might know that Hebrew phrase, that's Orach HaChaim, the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. At your right hand is eternal bliss. Protect my family with whose soul my own is connected. Into your hands I offer my spirit. Biado avkid ruchi. If you remember that phrase from the end of Adon Olam, into your hand I offer my spirit. You have redeemed me, O God of truth. And we say, Amen. Like I said, that's followed by the reciting of Shema, which ideally and traditionally, again, if at all possible, is the last thing that a dying person recites. and then when death has arrived and pronounced by the medical authorities, by whomever, then those who are with the person who has died, or whenever a relative, a friend, anyone in the community, when we have heard of the moment of death, the phrase is praising God, who is the God of truth, or the source of truth. Baruch atah Adonai Dayan ha'emet. That's so. If someone just says, it calls me up on the phone and says, Joe just passed away, before I even extend condolences, I'm supposed to say Baruch Atah Adonai, Dayan Ha'emet, the righteous, the righteous judge. Okay. From that moment, then, and now we're talking of the community, not uh, uh, we're not talking about the community as a whole, talking specifically about mourners and the family, and I'll define that the way that the Torah defines it, the way that Jewish tradition has defined it. But again, in our day and age, it's much more generalized and open. But we enter a period of several stages of bereavement and grief, each of which has halachic, meaning Jewish legal implications, as well as certain traditions, minhagim, and customs. The first stage is from when you recite that Baruch Dayan Ha'emet, that praise is the God of truth. That determines halachically that you have entered a period of what's called onanut. You are an onain in rabbinic Hebrew. I'm not sure what tradition, the best translation would be for that. It comes from the word that on the one hand it means suffering, on the other hand it means to answer or respond. So you could make all kinds of different homiletic interpretations of what it means to be an onain, if you're suffering or if you're immediately challenged to respond to the reality of your loved one or friend's death, whatever it might be. But that's the first category. And again, it starts in Jewish law. It starts from when you first recite that statement of I. So I have heard of the death. I acknowledge my grief. I acknowledge my belief in God, who is the righteous judge. Um, and the laws and the customs that develop during this period, which you can probably guess is going to be from now until the time of the funeral and the burial. This period of being in Onain are very, very cognizant of grief, of struggle, of, of tears. We call it tears and fears, sometimes even denial. But the most important thing is from the standpoint of Jewish law, you're almost immediately absolved or excused or exempt from performing most mitzvot. If you choose that you want to participate in the mitzvot, those that are meaningful to you, that's fine. But as an onain, with very few exceptions, with as an onain, you are exempted from performing any of the mitzvot. You're not expected to maintain. Also, you're not expected to maintain any of the social contacts, unless you do them within the context of performing a mitzvah. It was a lot easier for them, for the religious literature to describe that when everybody lived together in the same shtetl. Everybody was in the same neighborhood. And so when Joe died, literally within an hour, everybody in the community knew that had happened, and so the expectations of people towards the Onain, towards the mourner, were totally different as well. Um, the two, let's call them institutions or organizations that may be formal or informal, immediately are called to take charge. One is we're using the term today for our security guards, the shomer. Someone, it can be a family member, it can be a community member, but it certainly is supposed to be someone who is Jewish, an adult Jew, as a shomer, stays with the body, so that someone who is Jewish, if there are some communities that say it should be a family member, does not, from halacha, does not have to be a family member, but someone who is Jewish stays with the body until the time of burial. In some communities, it's traditional for that shomer or a group of shomrim to recite psalms, tehillim, especially continuously, 24 hours around the clock. Um, the the other organization that is called have is known as the Chevra Kadisha, or the Holy Society, and the Chevra Kadisha, or in our day, those are representatives of the funeral home who, sometimes they do the actual preparation of the body, what's called tahara, the ritual washing of the body. Obviously, it's women for a woman who has died, men for a man who has died. The ritual washing, removal of any jewelry or anything like that might be on the body, so that the body is as pure and empty, if you will, of any augmentation when it is buried. We'll talk a little bit later in a few minutes about how the burial takes place and what someone traditionally was wearing or prepared for the ultimate burial. So there's the shomer that watches over the body. Again, we assume that practice began when there were body snatchers, um, especially before jewelry or whatever may have been removed, or gold from the teeth, or whatever it might have been. So that it developed that way, but it's also. I mean, I remember not only with my parents, but also when our son Justin, our teenage son Justin, when he died at St. Jude's Hospital in Memphis. Uh, and the Memphis Jewish community is a strong community, but it's not a large community. And I was friends with one of the reform rabbis there, and one of the nurses who had taken care of him was a member of the conservative shul, and they came to us within 10 minutes of Justin passing away. Even though we're in this small community, there's no Jewish funeral home. There's one funeral home that most of us use because they're familiar with Jewish practice. The community will provide shomers. The community will provide the chevra kadisha, to be with Justin's body until he can be sent back to Detroit. We arranged that at least one member of the family was on the same plane that his body was going back to. Uh, and one of our kids jokingly said, "Well, would it count if the pilot is Jewish?" Suppose, I suppose that. So, those are for some people. I know, certainly for Lynn, and certainly for her family, who are much more traditional than my family. That was a very important, consoling notion to recognize that there was a shomer, there was always someone there, even in the hearse. There was someone who was Jewish who was riding with him. Um, so they're the two. There's the shomer, and then there's the chevra kadisha that prepare the body. Um, when um, uh, this now would be the point to the point in time to also just acknowledge the question comes up about embalming. There's great debate about embalming the body. It is permitted, but it's discouraged. That's the official statement of Jewish law. It's permitted and it's understood, especially if the civil authorities, or the medical examiner, or somebody like that says, yes, we need to embalm the body for whatever kind of reason. But if the civil authorities mandate it, we go along with that. If there's going to be a delay in when the funeral can take place, embalming is permitted, and it's permitted. They go all the way back to Joseph, to Joseph in Egypt, in the story that when Joseph died, his body. Now, granted, he lived an Egyptian lifestyle, but his body was embalmed, and then it was carried along before it was buried in Egypt, recognizing that it was going to be disinterred and taken with the children of Israel at the end of their slavery. So the official word, like I said, embalming is permitted, but officially discouraged, except except in cases either when there's going to be a long delay of waiting for the funeral to take place, which we just encountered incidentally a couple weeks ago. I forget it was right by Memorial Day weekend. There was Memorial Day weekend that linked into Shavuot, if I remember correctly. And so you have the 2 days of holiday of Shavuot, and then there was Shabbat, and then there was the Sunday on which most of the gravediggers do not have to work, and Memorial Day, in which the cemeteries may be closed for burials, etc. So there could have been like a 6 day wait from time of death until the actual funeral and burial could take place. And obviously, civil authorities would step in and say the body must be embalmed to be held that long before the burial. Okay, so you have that kind of situation. Um, we move then from being an onain into uh, after the next stage after the burial would be the more familiar sitting shiva. Okay, and so I'm going to just pause on just one or two comments about shiva, and then go back to talk about burial. Shiva officially can be canceled. It can be superseded. It's not always, although the Shiva, it's not really a play on words, but it has dual meaning. Shiva, on the one hand, means sitting. So people say, I'm sitting Shiva, which means I'm sitting for the 7 days, because Shiva is seven also. So the word, depending, it's the same in if you're writing it Shiva in English letters, but in Hebrew it would be written differently, but it's pronounced the same. So it has come to reflect both sitting Shiva in the sense that you are sitting, you're sitting so that you are lower than other people because you are at the lowest part of your life experience when you're in mourning. So people traditionally sit on benches or sit lower than the other chairs that might be in the room, or even you're not, so if you're sitting Shiva in mourning, you're not even supposed to stand up when others come into the room, unless, sorry to say, unless it's a rabbi or the way they say, or the king or the emperor. So unless you're expecting a royal visit, then you do not you're not supposed to stand up. Um, but Shiva can be deferred. It can be canceled, depending on circumstances, depending on the calendar. Like if a holiday or a holy day comes along, certain or Shabbat, certain days will cancel Shiva. If you've already been sitting for 3 days and then then comes to be Rosh Hashanah, that cancels the rest of the Shiva. You don't wait. You don't restart sitting Shiva after the traditional 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, for example. Um, and for others, if the death and the burial occur during Sukkot or during Pesach, for example, during the fall festival or during Passover, most of the authorities, there's some who disagree, but most of the authorities say that you don't officially sit Shiva until after the holiday, and then you would start your Shiva after the holiday. So there's they always say, if you're looking it up or if you're asking somebody, they would always say, we refer to your own rabbi and let the rabbi tell you which way he or she interprets the tradition on how you should do it. But the Shiva itself, the sitting Shiva itself, um, has has a couple different stages stages in it that we'll talk about. Like for the first 3 days, there are certain limitations, and then for the remaining days of the week, there are fewer limitations, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll come back to that, but a few comments about the burial itself. Now, you have to remember that, um, and I alluded to it a few minutes ago, that frequently, not universally, not always, but frequently, Jewish practice or even fulfilling the mitzvot. We talked about this in the Torah session. Fulfilling the mitzvot sometimes is superseded by the decree of the civil authorities. The phrase in Jewish rabbinic literature, legal literature, and it's also interpreted in the New Testament, incidentally, which comes from the same time zone, is Dina de Malchuta. Dina is that the law of the sovereignty becomes the law. With there are exceptions. There are 4 or 5 very important exceptions, but usually, so like I said, if the civil authorities mandated that the body be embalmed, even recognizing that Jewish tradition frowns on that, but we have to follow it. So Jewish tradition and literature and custom all strongly encourage, I guess encourage would be the word we'd have to use, strongly encourage burial to be as soon as possible, which is usually defined as 24 hours, as soon as possible after the death, and also that burial be in the ground to fulfill the description of from dust we came and to dust we return, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. However, it is very, very clear from history as well as the literature that Jewish burials have taken place above ground, in caves, in stone sarcophagi, huge tombs that are above ground. And we're not just talking about the average Mr. and Mrs. Chaim Yankel, or whatever their names might have been in Greek times or Roman times or whatever. We're we're not talking about the VIPs. We're not just talking about many of the rabbis who are buried that way. We're talking about that was the typical practice, to be buried above ground. In our day, especially think of those areas of the world that are encountering flooding, whatever. I mean, all those cemeteries in New Orleans, for example, are above ground because of the water table and things like that. Um, so again, the Jewish tradition leans towards or encourages the burial to be in the ground. And if you ever watch like a video or something of a burial in Israel, especially like on the Mount of Olives, the the body wrapped in shrouds is just placed right in the ground, right in the earth. That no coffin, no protected anything, no walls around it, just placed in the ground and earth, then thrown back respectfully, but it's thrown back on top of it. And that's what's mandated by many of the cemeteries in Israel, especially, and in many of the Jewish communities. However, I certainly know this in my 40 plus years of being at cemeteries and whatever all over the country, is that a particular, it's not only state, it might be a particular city or township, municipality that says that for cemeteries in our district, there must be this protective vault, for example, that must have a bottom, or must have some kind of a top, so that once the earth is placed more and then there's grass on top of it, we don't want it to sink down, and whatever. So different towns, municipalities, again, that Dina de Malchuta Dina are gonna say this is what you must do if you're going to be buried in a cemetery in our town. Contrast that with sometimes, in one way or another, all of us will be there and encounter these kinds of questions in our lives. Um, Contrast that with the emotions of the mourners and the survivors who say, I just can't picture my mother just being wrapped up in shrouds and literally just thrown into the ground. I want her to rest in peace in a beautiful coffin, that has Jewish stars all over it, and whatever. So the funeral home business has taken advantage of that, recognizing that Jewish tradition again is that the burial should be in as simple, with no ostentatiousness whatsoever, a simple pine box, a simple, doesn't have to be pine, but a simple wooden box, preferably with no metal connections, or what's the word that I'm looking for? Hinges or anything like that on it. Again, because the wood will decompose much quicker than the metal pieces would, and also because the metal symbolizes agents of war and battle and fighting, and we don't want that to be the image that goes along with dear mother. We want her to be totally at peace. Um, the the overriding principle, as I was joking before about VIPs and rabbis and kings and queens and whatever, the overriding principle is that everyone should be buried in the same manner, in as simple a way as possible, with the least amount of pretentiousness, so that the king or the pauper, the phrase is that the king or the pauper are equal in the sight of God, no matter how strongly or how quietly people on earth may have respected or worshipped. Well, not worshipped isn't the right word. Respected or loved the individual. Everyone is equal in God's sight at the time of death. Um, again, keep it as simple as possible, and again, the directive is as much as possible avoid using anything in the burial, anything that would prevent the natural or delay the natural decomposition decomposition of the body. Yeah, Bobby, please.
When the casket is put into the vault,
When there is a vault.
yeah, when there is a vault, because with my mother, their cemetery required.
Uh-huh.
How does that affect the decomposition?
It delays it, but again,
But it does
the
eventually decompose.
right, right. But eventually, I mean, that's kind of the answer. Is that eventually, and some of the vaults, are only like maybe just the walls and a bottom, but not the top, or just the top and nothing in the bottom. So they do it that way.
Yeah, the
I'm
full
not,
vault that they
yeah,
required.
right,
Thank you.
right, right. Okay. Um, Traditionally, everyone is buried in the same
What?
kind of what are called tachrichim, or
Okay.
shrouds, male or female. Well, again, with the same underlying principle being that everyone in death is equal. Um, if someone insists, and this traditionally was men, but in our day it could be women also. If they insist that they want to be buried wrapped in their own talit, that's either instead of like wearing a man would be wearing a suit and then wrapped in their own talus, or woman also wrapped in the talus rather than just in the shrouds. The tradition is that at least one of the fringes, the fringes in the bottom of the talus, that one of the fringes would be cut off. Again, it's a symbol tearing the clothes, renting your clothes is a symbol that if the talus is the ultimate piece of clothing that our loved one is going to be living in for eternity, that there's still sadness associated with it. So we make the cut in the talus. Um, Last time we were together months ago, Michael Gervan had asked about what happens when there's a limb that has been amputated earlier in life, and that limb is supposed to be buried, and ideally buried in the same uh, plot where the rest of the body will be buried eventually. Most people, however, don't aren't prepared for that much in advance, despite how often we tell people to do that. Um, but that's what's supposed to happen. Ideally, is that if the limb is amputated and then buried separately, if necessary, when the person dies, then those parts of the body would be reunited and buried together. A comment on cremation. Um, Again, Jewish tradition is relatively clear that cremation was more than discouraged. It was prohibited as a choice. It was acknowledged that it might happen. I mean, indeed, some of the greatest and most respected leaders of the community were burned at the stake, were torched, were died by fire. And obviously the tradition, the rabbis and the sages didn't want to say, aha, the great Akiva never, his soul didn't go to heaven because it was burned. So that they didn't say that, but what they could say was, if it's a matter of choice, cremation should not be considered. Um, and that was the case for thousands of years until the Holocaust, until the Shoah. When you're not talking of individuals, you're talking about millions who died that way. And the thought that all of them, certainly, absolutely, with no choice of their own, that their bodies were burned, and went up in smoke. So the traditional community has kind of put on put aside the long-standing prohibition about cremation. They still don't overly encourage it, but they recognize it. Many of the rabbis will put a choice for cremation in the same, and I don't necessarily agree with this, but just telling you, they put it in the same category as suicide. Technically, a suicide was someone who died by suicide was not allowed to be buried in the holy ground within the sacred sections of the Jewish cemeteries. Up until several generations ago, when most of the leading uh, rabbinic authorities rewrote their responsa, their teshuvot, and said that we will now consider an act of suicide as the act of a person who was ill, and then mental illness does not disqualify you from being buried in sacred ground. So what a lot of traditional Jewish cemeteries have been doing is they've been setting aside sections in small sections in the sacred boundaries, with a fence or a driveway or whatever it might be, of the Jewish cemetery. They've designated a specific area for the burial of cremains. Now, in my experience, in all the different communities, most of the people who choose to be cremated, the family winds up either keeping the cremains in an urn or something like that somewhere in their house, in their possession, or scattering the ashes in some kind of a place, or in the river, or in the ocean, or wherever wherever it might be. But the compromise in most major Jewish communities that I'm aware of is that at least one of the Jewish cemeteries in the metropolitan area has a designated section for burial of cremains. That's how they're dealing with it. They're dealing with it today. So, who officially is designated as a mourner, and all of the laws and the customs and the restrictions, the limitations, and as well as and the obligations, but also the privileges um, of being a mourner. They to give that list, they go back to a section of the book of Leviticus, in the Torah, that describes the limitations and the obligations of the high priest, especially, or anyone who's serving as a priest or a Levite. Levites being like the assistants to the priest. So you have your senior rabbi, you have your assistant rabbi or associate rabbi. So you have the priest, you have the Kohen, and then you have the Leviim, then you have the Levites. And there's a list, because being in the presence of a corpse, um, makes one defiles, as it were, makes one's prayers. Well, it wasn't prayers in those days; it was the sacrifices and the oaths that might be taken, if the priest or Levite was in the presence of of a corpse, it makes those sacrifices impure and unacceptable to God. Therefore, uh, someone who was mourning, any of the Levites or the priests had to say, no, I can't participate in this sacrifice because I've been in the presence of a corpse. Here, you go to my assistant, or go down the hallway, go to the next town, or whatever it might be. Um, but there's a list there of for which members of your family, if you are a priest or a Levite, for which members of your family you must defile yourself. You must still participate in in the ritual, if you will. And they say that's for father or mother, for spouse, for son or daughter, for brother or sister. Okay. Not for an in-law, not for a cousin, but father, mother, spouse, son, daughter, sister, brother. And again, some of us are well aware what was left out was a child. But again, in the conversation that some of us have been having over the last couple of weeks, is because even in the story of Aaron and Nadav and Avihu, when Aaron tries to mourn when his two sons die, it says Vayidom Aharon, that Aaron was silent. Um, and Moses took over because Moses was their uncle, and the uncle is allowed to participate in those things, not the parent. Um, so they have to address all those. But those are technically, according to tradition, those are the relatives. If one of them dies, those are the relatives that you must participate in the mourning practices of Shiva, etc. What we're gonna be talking about. That you must participate for those immediate members of the family, parents, spouse, children, and siblings. Okay, you may participate, or you may choose to participate in them for anyone else, as long as you're not, again, crossing the line and either doing something or using that mourning as an excuse of why you're not fulfilling another mitzvah. Okay, so that's the line. So people say, well, is it okay for me to say Kaddish for my father-in-law? Okay, because technically, according to that list, I'm not a mourner for my father-in-law. The answer is absolutely yes. You can say Kaddish. Not that you must say Kaddish for him, but that you can say Kaddish for him. So that's how they make that kind of a distinction. Um, okay. When we come to the moment of burial, and again, in tradition, there wasn't a whole long funeral. I mean, when everybody lived so close together, uh, everyone participated. Okay, come along. We're going to be burying Joe in a couple hours. Join the procession going from the house. There was no hospital, or hospice or funeral home. We're going to have a procession, a holy procession from the house up to the cemetery. You remember the teaching that when you move into a new town, for Jews, when you move into a new town, the first thing that you buy is land for a cemetery. Okay. Incidentally, what's the second thing that you buy? Anybody know? Yeah, Bobby, what?
The pot. your personal plot, your
No,
personal,
no, 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 no.
no?
No, I mean, if you're new into, if you're opening, if you're starting a new Jewish community somewhere,
Oh, okay.
okay, the first thing that the community buys to provide is the first thing is the cemetery. What's the second thing? Yeah,
Amy.
Amy, do you remember?
The temple,
Mhm.
a
No,
place of worship.
temple's actually, a place of worship is actually lower, way down there. It's about five or six.
Really?
Yeah, Gene.
I would say someplace to put the Torah scrolls.
Because you don't need to have a Torah scroll. Okay, but that's farther down. That's farther down the list.
Mezuzah?
No, 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 no. An orphanage.
Oh,
Orphanage is the second thing, and a school is the third. Those all come before a temple or a synagogue.
oh,
Okay, yeah, but an orphanage was the second thing that they would provide. Okay. Anyway, all right. So if we're at the grave, or nowadays we do this at the funeral home, for example, there's kriya, which is tearing. Some people actually tear some of their clothing. Um, most communities nowadays have these little black ribbons, and you can either use a razor blade or just tear it yourself. I know quite a few men who will make a cut in their necktie, and whatever. But the kriya again is the and again, that's only required to be done for those list of immediate family members that we were talking about. Anyone can participate in it as a sign of public mourning, but the immediate family members are required to. If you're making the kriya, the cut, for a parent, this is a tradition. I'm not sure where it comes from, but it's a tradition, and it goes back at least Shulchan Aruch, so it goes back at least 500-600 years, which is relatively new in Jewish history. Come to speak. But if you're doing the tearing or wearing a ribbon or whatever for a parent, some communities say the parent for a parent goes on the left, or for any other family member it goes on the right. Okay, I'm not sure. Maybe some of the very traditional communities still follow that. It's really possible, but most people just the funeral director or the rabbi will say, which side do you want to wear it on? Or if you're making a cut in your real clothes, which side. A lot of men, for example, will make a cut in their breast pocket, which is always on the left, not on the right. So they would do it that way. And you might think that the designation of Shiva actually begins when you come home from the burial, but no, it actually, if you're saying at which time do you go from being an onain, like I said, which was the first stage or the first category, at which point are you now in Shiva, in the sitting or the 7 days? It's actually from that moment of kriya. Is if you're saying at which moment do you pass from being one to the other? Okay. Um, the if there is a procession going from the home to the cemetery, or even from the hearse, in some communities, from the hearse to the gravesite, there's a tradition of making seven stops, or seven pauses in the livaya. That's the livaya is a generic term that it comes to mean the whole funeral experience, or the whole burial experience. But livaya really just means the accompanying. So accompanying the body, accompanying the casket to the grave. Um, some people are saying, well, why seven? Well, is that also because it's Shiva? This is one of those. It's a respected custom, but we're not really sure where it came from. Is it because because of Shiva? So we now are designated publicly that we're making these seven stops because we're in the seven period, the seventh, whatever you want to call it. I don't know, the period of seven, Shiva. The one rabbi has said it's seven times stopping because the word vanity in Hebrew appears seven times in the book of Ecclesiastes, and Ecclesiastes starts out vanity, vanity, all is vanity, kind of thing. Um, uh, again, signifying that everyone will go through this moment at death and burial. The But again, that's only just as a custom, and there's lots of discussion about where it comes from and what it means. There's some communities that still maintain that. I believe that the Jewish cemeteries in Tucson, that they do ask that. That's been my experience. Is they'll say, Rabbi, are we stopping seven times between the hearse and the casket? Um, and then I'll usually ask the family, is that something that would be meaningful for them, and we can do it. Okay. um, after the burial with its prayers, and then the more recent tradition, again the last several hundred years, is that there's also, in addition to prayers, that there's also a eulogy. But we're cautioned not to overly praise the individual. So Jewish tradition technically is um, very hesitant to have these major state funerals with seven or eight speakers and three rabbis or three other family members or dignitaries giving long speeches and all that. It's supposed to be as simple and straightforward as possible. Again, because we're emphasizing that all are equal in the eyes of God. Um, the mitzvah, certainly, it's a mitzvah, but here it's mitzvah in the sense of good deed, not commandment. Is for the mourners to be the ones to shovel dirt into the grave, rather than the grave diggers, who most likely are not Jewish. um, and the notion is to, if at all possible, that as many people as possible who are comfortable doing so, uh, to participate with at least one shovel full. It might be a shovel, might be you're just using your own hand, and putting a token, gesture of earth back into the grave. Explained that, because this is something that the person who has died cannot thank you for. So you're not doing it with any expectation of being thanked or appreciated, or any expression of appreciation. It's a gesture that we make to the one who has died, as well as saying, no, those of us who are most bereaved are the ones who should participate in this, rather than just those who it's their job, or they're being paid to participate in this final act of tribute and comfort. Um, then the notion, it doesn't have a particular title or category, but the theme of the literature, as well as how tradition the customs and ceremonies develop shifts from um, this time at this point that we've been honoring the one who died. That was the purpose of the customs and protecting the body and preparing the body for burial in the proper way, and shomer, and guarding the burial, and making and those who are most bereaved are the ones who would fill the grave, etc. So at this point, when the burial or the internment ceremony concludes, the shift goes from a focus on the one who had died now to support and comfort those who are mourning. Okay, it's not that we stop remembering the one who died. But that our more important focus in our thinking and in our actions go towards those who are bereaved and those who need the comfort and the support. The first thing that we're supposed to do, well, some people say the first thing we're supposed to do is wash our hands. That goes back to this notion I was talking about before with the priest, that if you've been in the presence of a corpse, it makes you ritually impure. So you symbolically wash your hands to make it okay, that you become pure again, that you can recite the prayers that you would be saying during the rest of the day. The most important tradition is what's called, we go back to the house, the residence, or wherever the people are going to be marking their shiva, and what's called the Seudat Havra'ah is a meal of coming back to health. Now, in our day, sadly, it's become like a reception. It's become an open house. All right. And everybody shows up, and the mourning family feels that they have to provide for 40, 50, 60 people who may be showing up and whatever. That's not the tradition. It doesn't mean that you can't do it. If you feel that the people who are coming, that they deserve to be fed, but that's not Jewish tradition. Jewish tradition is for the mourning, the mourners, the mourning family, to come back to the house, to welcome each other at the house, and to immediately sit down to a meal, saying, we need to take care of ourselves. Okay. Sometimes that's very difficult. Sometimes, and some of you may have this experience. Oh, hi, Gary Melton from thousands of miles away, or whatever. Sometimes the experience, it's very, very difficult. I find people who come back from the cemetery, they don't want to eat anything. They don't want to sit down. They're nervous energy. They're grieving and whatever. But it's most important to sit down and have a little something to eat, and make sure that you're saying to yourself, I'm going to take care of myself. I have to make sure that I'm taking care of myself, because I'm no longer taking care of the one who died. Yeah, Bobby, please.
I think the best thing I did when my mom passed away, and I had it announced after the funeral, after the cemetery, we were going back to the house. And I had it announced for people to please wait till after 2:00 to come, so that we had a time to be at the house. And it
Okay.
was just the immediate family,
Uh-huh.
cousins, a couple of close friends that were
Right.
helping out in that.
Right,
But I didn't want a house full of people while we were having that first meal.
right, right,
And
right.
it was just announced a couple of times.
Usually what you do when you get back to the house is light a candle that burns for the Shiva period, for the seven days. There's no specific ritual or blessing for that. It's just something, again, it's kind of like, it's a statement for the family to be together, and light that candle. We usually tell people to put that candle. It's one of those tall things, and it burns. We have some at the temple now, Ruth Ann. We made sure that we have some that burns for a week, and we usually put it in the room where the Shiva services are going to be. that evening, for example. So it stands there as a reminder. But the question came up. This is not a new question to Rabbi Roman in the 20 or 21st century. Okay, the question came up. Okay, how much? Okay, Rabbi, I got you. We have to go back to the house. We have to eat something. How much do I have to eat? Do I have to eat a corned beef sandwich? Do I have to eat a lox and bagel? How much do I have to eat? And that's the source of the tradition that you have an egg on the shiva tray. Okay, not that you have to eat, not that you have to eat that egg, but the egg is there. Same kind of thing on Passover. For how much matzah do you have to eat? The egg is there as a measuring stick. Okay, that's how much the mourner must, from the standpoint of Jewish tradition, you must eat at least the volume of the egg. You want to eat the egg? Fine, eat the hard-boiled egg. But that's how much you must eat minimally to fulfill that
Yeah.
that obligation. Okay, and it usually is a dairy meal, but I don't know where that tradition, came from, and whatever. But that's the Seudat Havra'ah. It's a very important part of the Shiva, and the grieving process of making this statement and actually and acting it out. Of that, I realize I have to take care of myself. Okay. So you have something to eat. Okay. So Shiva is the generic term, and I said technically it starts from the time of cutting kriya. The more appropriate Hebrew word is avelut. We had onanut, and now this is avelut, translated as mourning, if you will. The day of the burial is considered day number one. It doesn't matter, even if the burial is at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, that's still considered day number one. As we talked before, the Shiva can be postponed for a holiday, or it can be canceled when you come to a certain holy days. Um, uh, the Shiva, by definition, was 7 days, but there's a distinction in some of the communities. In the early halacha, it was kind of modified. You can always take a mitzvah, all right, a commandment, and you can always enhance it. You can always make it larger, right? You can't diminish it. So, um, uh, so there are some people who said no. Originally, Shiva was only 3 days, and we expanded it to seven, and whatever. But they definitely had a distinction between 3 days and 7 days, and that's what the Reform movement, or the liberal progressive movements around the world, picked up on that and said, well, in our day and age, most people can't give up 7 days of work, and whatever, and sit there. It's exhausting, and it interrupts everything, and the kids can't go to school, and whatever it might be. So 3 days, there's justification for only doing 3 days. Most families today, that I'm aware of, except for in the Orthodox community, will sit 3 or 5 days. Shiva is always, you push the hold button for Shabbat. So if you're still counting the 7 days, but you're not sitting through Shabbat, there's debate as to whether Saturday night after Havdalah is considered a full day or not. There's debate, depends on how you want to count them. But like I said before, the tone changes, and now the community is there to support you. So people bring meals. The daily minyan and the Shiva services take place in the house, so that you don't have to go to the synagogue. you can stay in the home where it's the most respectful for you to be grieving. You don't worry about any form of personal vanity. Mirrors are covered, so you don't walk past and say, "Oh, I got to get my hair done," and whatever, or my makeup looks terrible. But you stay at home. That's the point, and the community comes to you, except for, and we're not talking about when there's a holiday or a festival that intervenes, except for Friday night and Shabbat. Friday night and Shabbat, you're supposed to go to the synagogue, and that's the point. You don't go for the what's called Kabbalat Shabbat, which are the introductory songs and prayers before we get to just about to Baruch Hu and on the Friday evening service. And that's why at the end of Lecha Dodi, that's where this custom comes at the end of Lecha Dodi of turning and facing the door, because that's when the mourners can come in. They don't come in for the joyful part of welcoming the Shabbat. They come in just for the worship part. So that's where that tradition comes from, of standing up and facing the door as we welcome not only the symbolic, queen, Shabbat queen, but of welcoming those who have been housebound in mourning for the week, and they come back into the community. Um, let's see. So which is more important, a wedding or a shiva? Okay. What happens if there's a family wedding? Now they didn't have bat mitzvah ceremonies, they didn't have a bris or anything like that, but they do have a discussion about what happens, and they it's framed as if there are two processions that come to the same crossroads, a funeral procession and a wedding procession. Okay, which one stops for the other? And the answer is that the funeral procession stops and the wedding continues. Okay, so just celebrate life, even in the presence of death. You celebrate life. So mourners are allowed to go to a wedding. Again, they don't talk about a bat mitzvah. They don't talk about confirmation. They certainly don't talk about final exams at college or anything like that. But they do talk about a wedding. Okay, you are not only permitted to, but you're supposed to attend a wedding. You don't go to the reception. You don't dance the hora. Okay, but you do go to the wedding ceremony, even if you're sitting shiva. That's the tradition. So again, the community is there to support you. Have the services at your home, provide meals. We talked about, you don't cover the mirrors, so that you're not tempted with personal vanity. There's also a superstition that the angel of death, the Malach HaMavis, right, who still could be lingering around in the home, but the angel of death can be seen through in a mirror. Can't see it through a window, but you can see it in a mirror, according to the Balabosta, get to you in a second, but the angel of death can be seen in the mirror, so that's why you cover the mirrors. But that's just a Bava Maisa. That's a superstition. At the end of Shiva, the custom is that the immediate mourners, again, those who were in that list that we talked about, parents, siblings, child, things like that. That at the end of Shiva, you get up and you walk around the block. People, why are we walking around the block? What is this? Well, again, picture everyone lived together in the shtetl. Everyone lived together within 2 or 3 blocks, and so your neighbor may not have been keeping track. The grocer may not have been keeping track. But if they see your family out walking around and they know it's not Shabbos, you're not going to the shul, you're not going to the synagogue. To oh, it must be they're standing up. The phrase is you've gotten up from your shiva, and you're designating that walking around that you're now coming back into normalcy. I'm sorry, I didn't get a chance to read it, Bobby. What was your chat comment?
Just that, I remember when Jack's father passed away, it was the week
Uh-huh.
before Sherry's bat mitzvah.
Ah, okay.
So then we buried his father. We stayed a day for Shiva with the family there. We came back to Buffalo after the second day. And the following Shabbat, everyone, his family was all in Buffalo from joining
Okay.
New York for the bat mitzvah. We did have
Okay.
services, they were acknowledged in services, and it was mentioned, condolences were mentioned to us, and
Right, right.
family went Saturday night to the services. We didn't have a big celebration planned at that point. It was just friends, just at my mom's house, which
Uh-huh.
was nice, because it was just sitting around talking, and the
Yeah,
kids.
made it easier to.
Yeah, we had a place for the kids to go to play their games, whatever, and,
Right. Okay.
but
All
yeah.
right. Okay. So then, quickly, because it's 3:15. So quickly, so the next stage after the Shiva is what's called Shloshim. Shloshim is 30. So that's a month approximately. Um, uh, and the 30 days, there's some communities that do an additional, like a second funeral. And in some communities, actually, the traditional pattern was that, as I said, at the funeral, you're supposed to limit the amount of the amount of praise and whatever, so that everyone is buried alike, and da, 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 da. It's at the ceremony of Shloshim usually that there were more dignitaries invited to speak. Again, after Justin died at the Shloshim, I invited one of my close friends, who's one of the professors from the rabbinic school, to come and do a teaching. That's how we commemorated it. Things like that. So for all except for the parents of the person who died, no, I'm sorry. For all of the parents of the person, the right. Say it again. For all those who have been sitting Shiva, except for your parents, Shloshim technically ends the mourning period. You're no longer obligated to say Kaddish. You're no longer obligated, for example, men who go without shaving, wearing the clothes that have a little tear in them, whatever. You only continue for the rest of a year. Some people say 11 months, but for 11 or 12 months, you only continue for your parents, for your mother and father who die. Of course, there are questions about, especially in our day and age, for step parent, and whatever, but that gets expanded. But the traditional law is that you're only required for that mourning period lasting 11 or 12 months if you're in mourning for your parents. You can extend it. Again, you can always make a mitzvah larger. You can always extend it. You can for other members of the family, but the requirement was only for your parents, and that's from day of death, not from the start of the Shiva. So we said the start of Shiva is from when you which may have been, it was usually the next day, but it may have been delayed 3, 4, 5 days, whatever. But the year's time, the yahrzeit, the year's time was from the day of the day of burial. I'm sure, looking at the people who are here, you all know that you're supposed to indulge in Torah study during the year. You're supposed to participate and give lots of tzedakah, lots of charity, and do social action projects. Join the social action committee, etc. During the year. Then there's absolutely no halacha. There's no Jewish law related to visiting the grave. There are lots of different community customs. Some people would say, no, you can't go to the grave until the end of the year. No, that's not law. It may be a community or an ethnic custom. That's not law. Putting a stone is a nice custom, but it's not law in any way. Putting up a grave marker is not law in any way. Most people do, but it's not law. Having an unveiling ceremony is not law. We usually do that. Well, I can't speak so much about Tucson, but back in the Midwest, that was usually geared to approximately a year that the stone or the tombstone, the marker would be installed, placed in the ground, and then we would do a dedication ceremony and unveiling ceremony, and people kind of informally use that as a marker of that's the end of the mourning period. Again, there were some people who said you don't go back to the grave until that marker is there. But one of my closest friends, actually, who lives in Jerusalem, but he was born in South Africa, in Cape Town. It tells me that in Cape Town, they as soon as someone died, they start making the marker, and they put the marker in at the end of Shiva. They do that quickly. So there really is no it must be this way, must be that way for a marker. And people ask me all the time, does the rabbi need to be there? Are there any special blessings or prayers that we need to recite? The answer to the first is no, a rabbi doesn't need to be there. There are traditional things that are recited, and I can Xerox them for you if you'd like. So I think that's I think that's about it. What I wanted to make sure that we covered. I've got a minute or two if anybody has a particular question, or if there are things that you think in this whole series about death and dying, if there are things that we haven't discussed that I can do some research and put things together and we can get into a third session with. Please, Amy, please.
One of my parents committed suicide, and at that time, my congregation had a habit of making announcements from the pulpit that so-and-so had lost a mom or a dad or whomever. But my congregation refused to do that because the death was a suicide. And I was deeply hurt by that.
Sure, I'm sure.
Sure.
I do not think that would be the case anymore. I really don't. The mainstream Jewish feeling, or even explanation, that certainly isn't the right word, but response to suicide is that it's the end result of an illness.
Right.
It's a terminal illness in that sense, and suicides are now, in most cases, are now buried in consecrated ground, and there's no ostracism attached to it.
Thank you.
I'm sorry that you had that situation, but we, as a community, we do learn from our experiences. Gary, how are you?
Still on mute.
Push the right button, Gary.
Early there.
Yeah. No, there you go.
There he
We're
is.
doing-
Good morning,
doing
Gary.
fine. Yeah, it is early morning here on Friday.
Yeah, and we're getting ready to fly to Bangkok this weekend to
Oh,
finally get my passport finalized. You know, they brought me in so quickly, I was kind of illegal for so far, but school started back in August, and it's the first time they've had kids in school for over 2 years here. So
oh,
parents and kids and everybody are really excited for a normal school year. And yeah, it's been going fine. A lot of work right now because we start hiring teachers for next year, next month. So I've got to travel for that too. But we're doing well. I'm sorry I was late. I got up in time, but I was
Don't
on
apologize.
I
Don't
was on a
apologize.
new.
We're honored that you could join.
I'm sure Ruth
I
Ann
was
would have
on
been up at
a
6.
different computer, and I didn't realize I had to set the whole Zoom thing up in order to get into the meeting, but I thought I wanted to do this. A lot of the things that you have going on, I'm at work during that time, but it's a Malaysian holiday today, and like I
Oh.
said, all we're doing is getting on an airplane and leaving a little later this morning. And so I thought, well, I wanted to hear what you had to
Okay.
cover anyway. So, yeah.
Well, travel safely.
Yeah.
Lashana Tova.
Shana Tova,
Thank
Shabbat
you.
Shalom. Say hi to Toy.
I will.
All
She's
right.
getting packed.
Great. All right. We hope to see you again soon. I'm going
Good
to
to
run
see all.
to have a doctor's appointment, an eye doctor's
Okay.
appointment, Bobby.
All right.
Okay. All right.
Good to
Thank
see
you.
all.
Bye,
Thank you,
everybody.
Rabbi.
Thanks so much.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Good luck, Norm, and thank you for doing this program. It was
Yes.
very,
Thank you.
very enlightening, very enriching.
Yeah. Thank you.